Madam President, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about our allies across the globe. And I'm doing so because they're important to our national security. That seems to be an obvious statement. But our allies seem to be getting a bit of a bipartisan short shrift of late. So I want to come to the floor of the U.S. Senate and talk about how important they are to our nation, to our citizens. And it's bipartisan, as I mentioned. As many of us have read on the campaign trail, presidential candidate Donald Trump has been critical of NATO, has been critical of our Asia-Pacific allies. Meanwhile, and in many ways, hasn't gotten the news it deserves because it's a sitting president. But in a recent article in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg entitled "The Obama Doctrine," President Obama himself is dismissive of many of our allies around the world. So I thought it was important to come down and talk a little bit about our allies, how important they are to U.S. security and to expanding American influence globally. So let's start with Mr. Trump. He's called NATO, which, by the way, happens to be one of the most successful alliances in the history of the world. He calls it an alliance that's, quote, obsolete and too expensive. About the members of the 28-nation alliance, he said, quote, either they pay up, including for past deficiencies, or they have to get out. And if it breaks up NATO, it breaks up NATO, unquote. Oh well, so much for the world's most successful alliance. However, contrary to public perception, leave that up. The U.S. does not pay for a majority of NATO's spending. We pay about only 22% of NATO's common funded budgets and programs for all of NATO, about 22%. You know, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, was here last week, and he informed me and many of my colleagues on the Senate Armed Services Committee that most NATO countries have stopped their decline in defense spending and have recommitted to NATO's goal of 2% of GDP, of their GDP, towards defense spending. So that's important. Working on the finances, reversing this trend. But here's the key point, Madam President. It's not just about finances. Over 1,000 non-U.S. NATO troops have been killed in action in Afghanistan, coming to our defense after 9/11. To go after the terrorists who killed over 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Over 1,000 of our NATO allies have paid the ultimate price. You can't put a price tag on that. And thousands of more have been wounded. Madam President, some sacrifices can't be measured in just dollars. Now, based on his comments, Mr. Trump also does not seem to fully comprehend how the presence of American troops in the Asia-Pacific has been the linchpin of security and prosperity in the region for more than 70 years. And today, our allies in the Asia-Pacific are substantially increasing their financial and military commitments in that region. Let me give you a few examples. Under Prime Minister Abe's leadership, Japan has amended its constitution to do much more militarily in terms of being able to work with us and even defend U.S. forces in the region. And as we are looking to rebalance and reposition U.S. forces in the Asia-Pacific over the next several years, the estimates from Pacific Command are that's going to cost about $37 billion. repositioning U.S. forces in the Asia-Pacific. Very important part of our strategy. A strategy, by the way, that the President talks about the rebalance, which I think is smart in the Asia-Pacific. Of that $37 billion for our forces in the military construction that's going to take place with this rebalance, about $30 billion will be paid by Japan and Korea. That's certainly paying their way. Let me give you a couple examples. Camp Humphreys, that's a military base, Army base in Korea. We're moving a lot of forces there, doing a lot of military construction there. It's going to cost about $11 billion. 91% of that is going to be paid by Korea for U.S. military forces. And in Guam, U.S. territory, where we are repositioning Marines and other critical military assets in the Asia-Pacific, Japan is paying $3 billion for that repositioning on U.S. territory. First time ever. Foreign country paying for military construction on our territory. So, bottom line, Madam President, there's no doubt that our allies around the world, particularly in Europe, need to do more in terms of defense spending. Many people have spoken on this. Former Secretary Gates, very well respected, he raises this in his recent bio. But it's simply erroneous to suggest that America would be better off without NATO or without our Asia-Pacific allies and alliances. Yes, they need to spend more, but there's a big difference saying we don't need our allies. So let me say that we should all understand that Mr. Trump, Donald Trump, he's a candidate. He's certainly not an expert on national security affairs, and his views certainly reflect the frustrations of many Americans, many members of Congress have about allies who are not spending as much on defense. Of course, we know this often happens during elections. We've seen that. It's an outgrowth of frustrations. But what is unprecedented is for a sitting president to be dismissive and even disdainful of our most important allies in a publication read by millions. To do so is not only unpresidential, it threatens to undermine ongoing U.S. national security interests. So I want to talk a little bit about that Atlantic article that I mentioned earlier, written by Jeffrey Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg, who had enormous access with the president for, I think, well over a year, traveled with him, Air Force One all over, numerous interviews. He takes us, Jeffrey Goldberg in his article, on a trip across the globe through the eyes of President Obama. And I would encourage all of my colleagues in this body to read that article. As I mentioned, Mr. Goldberg has significant access to the president, but the tour across the world leaves us no doubt that the president not only views himself as the smartest man in the room, he's the smartest man in the world. In Mr. Goldberg's words, President Obama, quote, has found world leadership wanting. Global partners who often lack the vision and the will to spend political capital in pursuit of broad progressive goals, and adversaries who are not, in his mind, as rational as we are. The president assesses the various strengths and weaknesses of our allies, and in his view, only German Chancellor Angela Merkel measures up. There's a whole list of leaders from countries that are allies of the United States that are mentioned in this article. The president calls the president of a critical NATO country a, quote, failure. And he is openly disapproving of the leadership role of Britain and France, and openly complaining that neither did their part with regard to Libya, where the Obama administration famously or infamously announced that it was leading from behind. The jabs and the stories in the Goldberg piece at other leaders, like the leaders of Jordan and Israel and Saudi Arabia, are gratuitous. Now, Madam President, these might be appropriate for later in the president's memoirs, as he's writing his memoirs, talking about world leaders and where they measure up, where they're weak, but not while he is still the president, while he still has work to do for our country. And the president even trains his fire on American leaders. Big section in there, how the president viewed Ronald Reagan's leadership in foreign affairs and his shortcomings, President Reagan's, and members of the foreign policy establishment, and even General Lloyd Austin, the well-respected and recently retired commander of U.S. Central Command. Everybody seems to be lacking in the president's eyes. And it's not just individuals. It's the way we as a nation supposedly conduct our foreign policy. By the president's own account, he has been a bulwark against American hubris, that's his words, self-righteousness, his words, and foreign affairs. Let me repeat that. His view is he's been a bulwark against hubris, our self-righteousness, and foreign affairs. But, Madam President, as you know, whether it's Alaska or West Virginia, most Americans understand another, more historically accurate narrative of our role in foreign affairs throughout the world. It's not one of hubris, but one of sacrifice and commitment and courage in defending freedom for hundreds of millions of people across the globe. That's been the role of the United States. And for decades, especially since World War II, there's been a bipartisan, long-term effort by truly some of the smartest people in American foreign policy, who were present at the creation, as Dean Acheson said in his autobiography, and beyond, to deepening our relationship with other countries, and as part of doing that, establishing the forward presence of U.S. military power around the world. Some of America's best minds, Marshall, Acheson, George Shultz. Why did they do this? Because forging these alliances ultimately not only advances the goal of freedom and a more peaceful and prosperous world, but it helps ensure that American influence and power remain preeminent, and most importantly, that our citizens remain safe. So, Madam President, in assessing our significant international challenges right now, one central truth stands out. Many of our enemies and potential adversaries and rivals are ally poor, while the United States is ally rich. Think of countries like Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and terrorist groups like ISIS. Very few allies that these countries have. Very few other countries running to them right now. Then think about our allies throughout the world. It's time to recognize and double down on this uniquely American comparative advantage in foreign affairs. We're ally rich. Our rivals are ally poor. We need to take advantage of it. And yet, the Obama administration seems to have ignored it. Indeed, Secretary of State John Kerry has spent more time wooing adversaries like Iran and Russia than doing the hard work of deepening the bonds of trust with our allies. This, coupled with the president's remarks in the Atlantic, his missives directed at friends, makes it seem like they're actually repelling allies, not working with them, not building up trust. This, of course, is a mistake. And like many in this body, I've had the opportunity to serve my country in different capacities, trying to work to advance the national security of our nation. And I've had the opportunity to see the positive results of the carefully woven fabric of decades of bipartisan American diplomacy, military engagement, and leadership throughout the world. Without American leaders who understand history and the important role our allies play in America's security and prosperity, the fabric of our alliances, put together over decades, threatens to unravel. And if it does, Madam President, the world is going to become a much more dangerous place. Now, our founding fathers provided the Senate with significant responsibility in terms of foreign affairs. And I'm hopeful that every member of this body will redouble our efforts to reach out and work with our allies so we don't continue this trend where leaders currently in the White House, or perhaps potential occupants of the White House, view our allies as a burden, when in reality, they're a key component of our security and our prosperity, and we need to continue to work with them. Madam President, I yield the floor.